Good morning, everybody. Thanks for a little bit of patience there. This morning we have the Scotch Whisky Research Institute here visiting from across the Atlantic. We're really excited about that. We are here at the University of Kentucky at the James B. Beam Institute for Kentucky Spirits. And this trip is all sponsored and hosted by or partnered by our friends at the Kentucky Distillers Association. I might just tee off here by thanking James Brosnan and John Connor for visiting us here in Kentucky with a small gift of our appreciation. Kentucky's where a lot of their oak barrels come from, and so we had these special cheese cutting boards made for you, and it's kind of important. So come up here and say good day to everybody for me. But what this is this is made by our wood products lab, where a lot of the barrels are produced from the forests of eastern Kentucky, and it really sets the backdrop. So first, join me in thanking our visitors for being here today. So thank you. Told you it wouldn't be the same. Thank you. And one of the things about those is that is the Archives Center in Eastern Kentucky, where the University of Kentucky is a land-grant school that have locations in every county across the state and serves industries. And we're really proud to serve the bourbon industry as a partner through the James B. Beam Institute. And the Archives, on the backdrop of today, while we're talking about sustainability, was hit really hard by the recent flooding, as we lost our Grain Center for Excellence in a tornado, and we're recovering from that. And we'll have Dr. Chad Lee speaking later on today. And thinking about grains, we lost a lot of our Wood Products Center to devastating flooding in the eastern part of the state. And as we experience these disasters again and again, it's a good time to think about sustainability and all the things that we're going to talk about today as related to applied industries. And so without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Dr. Stephen Schafrik from Mining Engineering, to speak about maturation house monitoring.
Okay, thank you all. And thank you, Seth, for the introduction and in the opening remarks. They were better the second time. So, first, I want to make some quick acknowledgments. What I'm going to be talking about is a variety of different things out of a variety of different projects. So I just want to thank both in the audience and also in the live stream all the professionals that we've worked with in the the spirits industry. It's just been fantastic, and it's been a great experience for the several dozen students that I've taken out on I almost said mine trips, but on trips out to distilleries and out to maturation warehouses. And also a lot of the input here this isn't all 100% my work. This is coming from me and also from a lot of the mining professionals that I work with, as well as a lot of the professionals that are in the audience and your colleagues. So I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be able to do this work. And I really feel like we are making a difference and that we can make a bigger difference in the future. So what has brought us to this is that there has appeared to be a new set of failure of barrels inside of maturation warehouses. And obviously monitoring what is going on in the environment inside of these warehouses is important to understanding what is going on with these, what appear to be higher losses than we used to find. And I've got two pictures on here. One is sort of a picture I use all the time to show what it would be unexpected rust on a barrel, but also the picture on the left is also showing rusting to the point of failure in pallet houses, which is generally thought that the pallet houses won't have this problem, but we do see it in pallet houses as well. Now, what I'm more concerned with is not just the loss of barrels and all of the time that's lost as a result of losing that fluid, but also the amount of corrosion that's going on in the infrastructure in these buildings. And so This is a year-old building. You can tell that the building is new because if you look at the wood, you can see it. But all of that conduit and infrastructure looks like it's 30, 40 years old. And it's a factor of the environment. So do be protecting these things. Like this is the type of, like not all corrosion's bad. All right, we expect some of it. So this is one of our greatest hits that shows the sort of corrosion that we expect to see over time. And a lot of these are out of decades-old buildings. But this is the kind of corrosion that we're seeing out of, 6, 7, 8, even less year-old buildings. And this is the sort of thing, when you're in your buildings, go around and look for this. These are telltale signs that you have some sort of problem in the environment. So what we've been calling like the new prevalence of rust in these buildings is, I think, a factor of, because of many different factors. So no matter what you do, wood is a natural product, so there's going to be a certain percentage of the barrels that leak. When I put more of those barrels all together, I'm going to have more total volume that's going to leak out. Right now, as I make stacks of these things thicker and taller, I'm going to create more barriers to the amount of air that can move through there to evaporate and take any of the vapors away from the barrels. So and then also as another factor here, barrels have a very large thermal mass. So if you think about it, the amount of energy that it would take to make one barrel change its temperature 1 degree Fahrenheit over 1 hour is about 400 BTU. Okay, so if I wanted to make 50,000 barrels change their temperature 1 degree Fahrenheit, I need to introduce into that warehouse about 20 million BTUs. So if I'm going to use natural gas in order to do that, at today's rates, I looked right before coming over, that's going to cost you about $85 for an hour to do that here in the United States. In the UK, it's about $99 an hour, and if you're in Germany, it's $240. So we're talking about an awful lot of energy that is just stored in these barrels to keep them their temperature. So as the temperature outside is changing and the barrel warehouse is generally not set up to insulate against that, in fact, that's the point, is to let the barrels change their temperature. Then the barrels are going to stay cool and the temperature is going to get hot, and it's a cold glass on a hot summer day, it gets condensation on it. Ethyl alcohol that's in vapor form in the air condenses down with that water onto the barrels and is causing the rust that we're seeing, not just on the barrels, but also on the infrastructure, et cetera. So you may go, okay, well, how do I deal with this, right? Well, the most immediate way to deal with it is ventilation. Get that vapor out of the environment. But there's also a time component to that. So we need to be able to predict when we want to be able to run these things. Or what you do is you just tolerate it. So I'm going to talk about both of those. Now, by the way, leaks happen, okay? And leaks are bad, but they look different. So if you're walking around your warehouse and you're looking for these kind of problems, the one on your left is what a leak would look like when you find it in the wild. What we're talking about is the cascading failure that you get from huge amounts of rust, and that's more of the middle and the side things. And you'll see that this is this bubbly orange rust that is what's going on. Now, I'm always getting a question about what do these condensation events look like and how do we predict them, et cetera. So here we got very lucky. There was one of the warehouse workers was in the warehouse after seeing one of my talks and saw condensation, took a whole bunch of videos and pictures of it. This was in May of 2021. The inside temperature was in the high 60s, low 70s. Outside it was in the 80s. I put the weather station information on here. And you can see from the video and from the pictures that we're not talking about a leak here. This is water mixed with ethyl. It's actually very basic. That is coming down off of out of the environment, depositing onto those barrels. And you can see this happens all the time. You can see the rust building up on these barrels. This is the same sort of rust that we're talking about. So the approach, again, like I said, the most immediate way to handle this, I believe, is to just get that ethyl vapor out of there. There is effectively no airflow through the stacks of the barrels. The resistance to airflow is too high. So whatever air does come into these warehouses through the windows sort of moves along the walkway and goes right back out the warehouse. The air has effectively no real reason to enter into the center of the house. So what we've done is we've brought some of our fans out to several warehouses and run a variety of different studies on those in order to figure out how much air we need to move and how fast we need to move it in order to evacuate the air out of this. And we've had a bunch of different successes. So let me go ahead and now. I've conducted easily dozens of site surveys. I do not turn anybody down. If you want us to come out and have a look at your warehouses, I am more than happy to do it. It is a great experience for me and for the students, and I love doing that. In fact, it's fantastic I teach ventilation. It's fantastic for the students in my ventilation class to go out and have something in person. So getting into some of the things that I was just talking about, what's really important about there being no airflow is that ethyl alcohol vapor is roughly twice as dense as regular air. So if I don't have air moving in a stack of air that's 6 to 7 stories tall, what's going to happen is the heavier vapor just makes its way down into the bottom of the warehouse. So for the most part, we see these problems in the first floor of the warehouse, sometimes up into the second floor, and in a really bad warehouse, we see it going all the way up into the third floor. Also at various points, we've been doing a lot of spot checking and things like that. So some of the guys at some of our partner distilleries have handheld sensors and are going out and send me data, and it almost looks like random data. And by the way, I'm going to skip through this real quick. This is one of our things where we went out to one of Beam's sites and evacuated the air out of a warehouse, and this is part of their internal discussion on that. So I really appreciate all the support from Beam that we've seen. And these were test sites that we were doing, but after a lot of this work from the test sites, there are permanent installations around that you're going to see. And this is an example of a permanent installation. So in the basement of the rick house, we've put in an inlet that goes to fairly inexpensive large diameter tubing. The point there is that we don't have to create a lot of turbulence. We don't want air running over the barrels, drying them out, or any other sort of thing. We're creating an area of low pressure so that when that density separation happens, the heavier gases are taken out of the building. We didn't really have to modify the building at all. It just went through an existing duct and put a fan on the outside. It's a very safe thing. And I'm really excited about this particular installation because right here in January 2021, this is the picture that I took. I went back a year and a month later, and this is the same picture of that exact same inlet. I guarantee you that we found the corrosive air. Okay, it was 100% going through that. That looks like a 50-year-old duct, and it's a year and a month old, and it's also eating out the fan. So I expected it to last a little longer than that, but these things happen. So let's talk about how the alcohol varies over the course of the day and the month inside of these houses. This is data from one of our research partners, Struck You Right, that has an online constant monitoring tool, and they're able to monitor alcohol vapor. So for what is a typical warehouse, and I just picked January through August, what you see is the average of the readings that are taken. 4 readings are taken an hour. The average of that over the course of the month from January to August in this warehouse, and this is typical of what we see, is just steadily rising. Okay, so you go, okay, let me take a typical month out of that steady rise. Now it's steadily rising because they're not treating the situation. As time goes on, more and more leakage is happening, more and more evaporation is happening. The alcohol vapor is just sitting there going in and out of solution. And over the course of the month, what you'll see is that the average over the course of the month is moving about 400 parts per million of alcohol vapor, and it is also steadily rising. All right. So if I take a random, well, not a random, if I take a typical day out of the month of April there, and I look at the alcohol distribution over the course of the day, you see that it also has about that 400 parts per million swing over the course of the day. And by the way, that's why our data that we've been collecting by hand look fairly random, because it does change over the course of the day inside of the warehouse. And what I want to point out is that from other work that's been done here at UK, they find that condensation events tend to happen around midnight. And if you look on here, the reason alcohol vapor would be coming out of the air is because it's mixing with the humidity or being condensed onto the barrels. So if indeed from that other project, the condensation events are generally happening around that time of night, that's why we're getting this separation that I have squared off in there. So that's the process of the alcohol vapor being taken out of the air and condensed down onto the barrels. And what I also put on here was the temperature for that day and the dew point for that day. And you can see that these two follow generally the same trend. Now, dew point is a function of temperature, which is why those two follow the same trend. But alcohol vapor's got nothing to do with either, right? But it's following the same trend, although there is a time component to how those two are not following each other's trend. So in the future, and what we're doing right now is I'm baselining a bunch of sites in order to figure out what is the alcohol content that we should expect into the air, and then we're going to bring in fans and evacuate the air and see how that affects that baseline. Now, unfortunately, I don't have that done right now, so stay tuned. Hopefully, at the industry conference, we'll be talking about that more. Now, just for a minute, I want to real quickly talk about the materials work that we're also doing. This is being done a little bit different than the ventilation work. This is being done as what's called a capstone project, or a senior project in material science and engineering. The faculty advisors are Dean Buckheit, Associate Dean Balk, and myself. We're doing a multi-year effort. So what we've done is we've come up with a variety of materials that are acceptable to use for hoops, and also a variety of coatings that we can put onto those materials. And then we pass that along to our industry partners and to the barrel manufacturers. And we said, what things do you want us to test and what things do you want us to not test? And we put together these corrosion boards that are out distributed into warehouses, trying to get them to show or not show a variety of corrosion. Well, this was taking too long. So what we decided to do was create an accelerated or a cabinet rusting process. And the students have really done a fantastic job of putting this together over the last year of putting together a real process that is able to generate what are the same style, same look, the same feel, and same chemistry as the rust that we are encountering out in the field. And so we're really excited about this work. So now what those students are spending this year doing is really destroying a whole bunch of samples. Although hopefully it'll be boring work for them so that some of those coatings are going to work really well and they won't be able to destroy those samples. So here's another one where stay tuned on that. There'll be at least a poster, I hope, if it gets accepted at the industry conference, which will be in March. And so we should have at least preliminary results from that. And by this time next year, we should really have a lot more information on that, at least from the accelerated testing. So, just to conclude here, I obviously glossed over a whole bunch of really important technical details. I'm easy to find, easy to get a hold of, and I love talking about this sort of stuff. And so, generally speaking, I think the long-term permanent solution to this is going to be the materials approach that we're taking on. But if you're having a problem right now, that materials approach isn't going to do anything for you. Let's get that corrosive environment out of your warehouses so that we can make sure that these buildings that we're investing in and the fluids that we're investing in for our products for the future aren't being lost because we're just not treating the problem. So with that, I would thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for going over. So.
I'll jump up here.
Yeah.
They want to swap a computer out, is that right? I'm still getting messages that we're not getting good audio coming through. I'll jump in.
Okay.
Yeah, do you want to take a second now and try to swap that computer out? I'm still getting messages that no one can hear. You are too? Yeah. No problem. Yeah, I might be able to guide people in if you can give me instruction. Okay, yeah, no problem. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Schafrik, we can have an internal powwow. Yeah, sure.
Acetic acid, both are highly, yeah, both are highly corrosive, and in both our laboratory testing and in the field, that's what we're experiencing. When I try to explain it to people, it's the same sort of thing as once we started putting ethyl into gasoline, everybody's engines started rusting out. And it's effectively that same process. But for the real chemical discussion of that, I'd have to refer you over to Dr. Buckheit. So, yes, sir.
Talk a little bit more about airflow. I know one of my colleagues say, well, those small houses, they have the airflow, and that's probably why the West is bad, but the work that you've done shows.
Yeah, okay, so the question I should have just gone like that and held the mic out. The question is to talk a little bit more about the effect of airflow and how the airflow affects things. And what I would refer you back to, I use this one particular slide a lot, and the reason I use it a lot is it's rather dense. So I would refer you back to this slide, right? Okay. So there's two components to that. The one component is how much availability for things to affect the environment is there. So if the warehouse doesn't have as much barrels, let's pretend for a second that you have the same likelihood of leakage no matter what, right? So the less barrels that you have in a particular place, the less total volume of leakage that you would expect. The other issue is the less number of barrels that you have in a place, the less total thermal mass that you would have, right? So that place is going to change its temperature much more regularly than a place that has a lot of barrels in it. So the airflow component of it is not as important a component overall for that smaller place because the availability of the corrosive agents to the environment is overall less. So somewhere there's like a tipping point that once you tip over that tipping point, then you have to start considering I've got so much likelihood and total volume available to me that I need to start dealing with this. I can't allow just the natural ventilation processes to handle it. I need to handle it mechanically. I need to start getting involved here. Okay. Right. So for the most part, well, we'll probably need to talk about this offline. For the most part, some of those older warehouses, there's some other convolving factors. So in particular, some of the really, really good older warehouses that I've seen are either super well sealed or super terribly sealed. Okay, like it's one or the other. All right, and so when you put that together, then when I come out and do a pressure survey, then I can get a pressure differential between the inside and a much older warehouse that is super open than the outside. The other thing is they had to put in more walkways because they didn't have the mechanical advantages and machines that we have now. So their stacks are actually more spread out. So the resistance to airflow of the stacks is much lower. So the proper answer to your question is it is super site specific, and that's because there's no like standard warehouse. I don't have a lot of good survey data from things like if you have soil flooring and all that sort of stuff too. So, but generally, the short answer is either totally seal it or leave it open.
We better wrap up at this point here and move on to our next speaker. Are you getting sound? Good. All right. Sorry about that out there in the audience online. We've had a little technical issue, but we should be back up and going now. I think this is Steve's water. So our next speaker is Dr. Chad Lee from the Grains and Forage Center for Excellence here at the University of Kentucky.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all today. We just went from a very technical presentation on what goes on in warehouses, rickhouses, and some of that. And we're going to talk about the other side of this, the raw materials that go into making the alcohol in this process. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm an agronomist. I work in grains area, and I'm going to talk just briefly today about corn and rye. We had a good sidebar conversation about barley earlier. Maybe we'll dovetail back into that if time allows. One thing I want to point out for us is that in Kentucky we do corn, soybean, wheat. We're trying to bring rye back into the rotation, maybe barley. It's a rotation. So we're growing these crops, rotating from field to field every year. So keep that in mind when we talk about this. So part of my job is looking at the overall system, not just how the one crop does one year, but how does it work in the overall system for the farmer? What makes the farmer profitable in that production system? I think the biggest change we've seen in the last 20 years is most of our grain farms in Kentucky now have on-farm storage. Not just storage, but drying capacity, and in the case of an operation like this, cleaning capacity as well. And so these farmers have set themselves up well to be suppliers locally for the bourbon and distilling industry here in Kentucky. This is one operation that has about 25,000 metric tons of storage on site. Every acre, every hectare of corn that goes through their farm goes through this facility and gets dried and treated, handled before it eventually gets sold into a distillery. This isn't the only farm that does this. A lot of our farms have this capability now. We mentioned changes in climate. It's imperative to us that this is absolutely necessary for a farm in this region to be profitable long term and ensure high quality grain. We have to have this final step in the process. A typical wheat field in this case in Kentucky, this wheat was harvested and soybeans were put into it. And on the other side, where you see the brown field, that's actually residue where that corn was planted into in a no-till system. At the end of the road, you see the grain handling facility for this operation. Another operation that also supplies a lot of corn and some wheat into the distilling industry. I mentioned the term no-till. So no-till really, there's some arguments about where it really began. In modern agriculture in the 1960s, there was a farmer in western Kentucky that started no-till. My predecessor at the time drove 7 hours before we had the parkways, Eric, drove 7 hours to tell him he was crazy, and then spent the rest of his career learning how to make no-till work. and ended up going to Argentina and Brazil and other places around the world and talking about the gospel of no-till. So in no-till, we're not tilling the soil. The only type of tillage that gets done might be right in the seed zone at planting, but no other tillage going into the field. Very, very different than what we think about with agriculture for 10,000 years. So in this case, we've got no-till wheat that goes in behind the corn. There's also no-till soybeans that will go in after the wheat crop, or in this case, no-till rye in this area. The other thing that farmers are looking at now is that we do have, in our rotations, we do have some gaps in the winters, and some winters we're not growing a cereal crop for grain. It doesn't fit the calendar. And so these farmers are looking at putting cover crops in, and they started with cover crop rye, which gets us to how do we start bringing rye back in the state. It was first brought back in as a cover crop, simply with the idea that we plant it in the fall, we terminate it in the spring, we plant the next cash crop, and its sole purpose was to reduce erosion, maybe capture excess nutrients, keep our waterways clean, and things of that scenario. But for all the good things it does for us environmentally and long-term with soil health and sustainability, there are some challenges with it. And so part of my research involves understanding what those challenges are. Simply doing a good practice to do a good practice, and most of you can relate to this, if it costs you a lot of money to do that good practice, to where it's a negative every year on the books, you probably aren't going to do it very long. Eventually, the farmer has to make a profit with this system, or it's just not going to last. And so that's a big part of what we're doing in that area. But that gets us into, so these farmers were growing rye as a cover crop, just terminating it, and a few of them said, well, let's see if we can grow it for grain and actually make this work and have this fit into our rotation. Put this on fields we don't normally put into wheat. Do some other things along those lines. We've been working with these individuals for the last 4 or 5 years. We've had a really good partnership with several other organizations. One of the things we learned is that our yields are a little bit lower than what they see in Germany. Our cycle's shorter. So your barley is probably going to grow for 10 to 11 months in Scotland, England, and that area. Rye grows for about 11 months in Germany. It grows about 9 months here. And our duration for seed fill is shorter as well. And so what we really need, our next step in this process, is we need to develop some varieties that are relevant here in Kentucky that can handle our climate. Right now, most of the rye varieties that are out there, they're actually hybrids, and they're coming out of northern Germany, developed in that environment. Ella, we met Ella in Poland. She was a grad student working on a rye genetics project there. She's working on a PhD here to start this process. She's not going to finish it by any means, but she's gotten the process started and helping us look at it from that scenario. I'll be back up just for a moment. So the Germans told us that fusarium was not an issue at all. Don't worry about fusarium, worry about this instead. We said, well, we have a lot of fusarium in our wheat. That's something we deal with year in and year out. Turns out we have a lot of fusarium in our rye as well. So just because it works in one environment, there's always other challenges in other places. And so we've got to figure out some of those things to make this system work. One of the coolest things about this is Woodford Reserve was the first one to do this. They actually bought loads of rye grain off of some of these farmers early on. And the nice thing about it is they put it into their regular bourbon batch, and they're tracking it through the process. And then they're giving us some feedback every so often in the process to let us know how that rye is tracking. And the good news is the rye grown in Kentucky hasn't affected alcohol yield. So far, it hasn't affected flavor profile. We actually kind of hoped it would. We hoped it might give us a distinct flavor profile. Maybe we could market that. But so far, unfortunately, it's fitting within the profile pattern. And so the take-home story is, so far, the rye that we grow will fit just nicely into the batches. The challenge for the farmer is making sure we grow at high enough quality, avoiding some of these challenges like fusarium and the hot summers that we end up with, to where we can consistently get a high-quality grain that they can buy on a regular basis. And I think we're seeing some of that development take place. We have a few other distilleries that are buying some local rye as well, and a couple of others that have said that they're going to start giving us some information on how that rye is behaving in their batches. So we're appreciative of that. So it's a really fun project for us. If we can bring another small grain or two, if we can do barley as well and bring those into our rotation, those are 2 more crops we can diversify with. And in general, our farmers like to diversify. They like having multiple crops to work with. They wanted rye because it wasn't wheat, and they didn't want it to interfere with wheat and have potential diseases that carry from one crop to the next that way. So I think we've got some really good possibilities here to work in this area. Love to, I'm not asking for an invite, I'd love to get over to Scotland and see how they grow barley and see if there's techniques we can learn from that. If we go back 40 years ago, some of our farmers, some folks from the UK went to England to learn about wheat production and brought some of the concepts back for intensively managed wheat. We went to Germany to do the same thing on rye, and I think we're being somewhat successful there. Barley's probably the next one in the step. 9 minutes. How's that? All right.
Thanks. We've got time for a couple of questions. If there are any questions. I don't have. Yep. Sorry, Matt.
You'd made a comment earlier about a transition that the farms and the farmers will need to make towards drying and cleaning their own grains to be successful. Can you help explain why that transition needs to occur?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And again, I'm the agronomist, so I work with the crop in the field. And the first thing I show you is a picture of grain bins and grain storage, right? Because I think it is absolutely critical to a high quality crop. So one of the questions we asked that particular grower at the time, actually Glenn helped do this interview with that particular grower. I asked him what percent of his corn does he plan to dry every year? So historically, we've just let Mother Nature dry it in the field for us or get it close to a moisture where it should be. So for corn, you want it somewhere around 15, 14%, depending upon the distillery. 15% is considered dry. That's the marketing price that you see. The challenge is if you let it weather all the way down, you create chances for some diseases to come in that will come in after the corn is essentially done with its adding dry matter, adding weight to it, and just simply in the drying process. There's some other challenges with weathering. There's challenges with yield, with harvest efficiencies as well. So long story short, Aaron said, we intend to run every acre of corn through the drying system. Now, some of it we may be taking out 20 points or 10 points of moisture. Some of it we're taking out 1 point of moisture. But our intent is we run everything through the drying system. And what that has done for that farm and other farms that are in this area, it has allowed them to have a more consistent, higher quality grain crop, which is beneficial to you, but it's beneficial to them because they're capturing value on that and selling that at a higher value, whether it goes to you or whether it goes on a barge in a river, they're capturing some value off of that. The other thing it does is, and most of you can relate to this, is the farmers in this area basically serve in some ways as an elevator for a lot of the distilleries. So they're storing that corn in those bins for up to a year and delivering it to the distilleries when the distilleries need it. And so they're providing that service as well in there. We've seen it with corn harvest. I mentioned soybean before. We've seen it with soybean harvest 3 of the last 5 years, not this year, but 3 of the last 5. Particularly in this region of the state, we've seen farmers lose a soybean crop because they couldn't get it out of the field and put it into a bin. So we had late season rains and it damaged that. What's most surprising is we think with wheat and rye and barley, that comes off in June and July. What's hot? It should dry naturally. That should be just fine. But we also get rain, hopefully. Not as much this year as we needed, but hopefully we get rain. And if we get the rain, then we have the same issue show up. And so a lot of our farmers that grow wheat also cut the wheat early, dry it, we'll do some cleaning on it where they need to. And again, they're capturing value that way. So they're doing some pre-sorting, some pre-cleaning on their own so that they're ending up selling higher quality grain when it goes into the market. That's a long answer. Is that it? Okay. That was longer than my other description.
No, that's great. Well, I think we'll keep going for the sake of time. Please join me in thanking Dr. Lee for a great talk. So I guess I can just use this. Hopefully that works. So the cadence of this next talk is to really just drop back for a minute and really express some overview on what we hope to get out of this collaboration that we're building with this cross-Atlantic perspective. There's a lot of consideration right now given to these subject areas on sustainability, whether it's energy audits, and we have Professor Don Colliver, who goes around to the distilleries and does energy audits to really think about how to shore up energy efficiency. But then thinking about decarbonisation, thinking about spent grains use, water use efficiency, hydrology, the grain production system up and downstream, and oak is a big sort of challenges, a big umbrella challenges that we share across the Atlantic. And we hope coming out of today, and we hope going into next year, that we engage in more dialogue to share content, best practices, and innovations in this area. So really quickly, I wanted to kind of, from my perspective, give that overview while I have a slide up, and then really give a shout out to a couple of folks that I don't get a chance to talk about today, but we have access to, and some of our partner distilleries have asked more about, and that is the Kentucky Water Resource Research Institute, which is here at the University of Kentucky, led by Dr. Jason Unrein and Dr. Stephen Evans. And what is really, I'm just going to see if I can pull this up. This is one of those areas where we have an entire wealth of information at the Center for Applied Energy Research that's based on energy efficiency and decarbonisation. But this is another example here where the Beam Institute really is an open door into the university, and what I like to think of as $1 billion worth of intellectual and capital that can be at your use. And where we see this is watershed management, water use efficiency. We have an enormous student group that would love to delve into projects related to water at our partner distilleries. And here's some examples of prior research that have been performed by the Water Resources Institute, and looking at water balance models and drought resistance. No, you're good. Yeah, watershed sustainability, and as we spoke to about the interplay between the agricultural network with grains production, with forest management, and the influence of those on water resources are really, really important. So as we go through this sort of journey and this brainstorming together through today and this afternoon, I really want to engage in that thought around including water in that discussion. And I wanted to tell a brief story here about American white oak. And this is a story really quickly just about some of those research topics that we delve into a little bit deeply. And I have an enormous amount of gratitude to Maker's Mark Distillery and the Independent Stave Company, who said to go ahead and get this work done. This is a sort of work that would often be funded by a federal agency, but they have an enormous amount of interest in supporting long-term white oak sustainability, as you can imagine, and they wish to support the sequencing of the American white oak genome and the development of enormous amount of resources. This doesn't happen easily, and really I'd like to say a huge thanks to Meg Statton at the University of Tennessee and to Dana Nelson, who is weirdly not on here, but is in the back there. Dana, give us a wave. And who have, from the US Forest Service, who have lent in to this effort, as well as a range of other folks. But what really stimulated this thought, and I'd love to take some more of the KDA team and some other folks up there, is a germplasm site in Indiana that was planted 40 years ago that shows a planting from Minnesota all the way down to Mississippi and everywhere in between. You see an enormous phenotypic variation among oak trees. And with the interest in creating sustainable oak supplies, we realized at that time that we really didn't have any resources for the species. And if you want to study something now and be able to do any sort of breeding for future plots, you would need to have a genome in order to assist in that. It's kind of the language we speak in now for any sort of organismal biology. And this is Rob Samuels and Brian Mattingly here from Maker's Mark, who are sort of inspecting this site, and really were inspired to push forward the genome. We can use this information to increase efficiency of tree breeding and the improvement program that we have underway on Star Hill Farm. And that is something I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of the talk. But we really need this to understand, one, we've lost the chestnut, we've lost the ash, the elm. You know, oak is not something that's on that list of really high risk to be lost. It's quite an adaptable species, but we have no preparation to protect the oak long term. And so one of the reasons for doing this work is to be on the front end and not be waiting and reacting to a challenge, but to get out ahead of it and have our ability to protect the species using resistance breeding and in the case of any threat to the population. This is the white oak range, and what was selected was a tree actually at Star Hill Farm that was dated at somewhere between 300 and 500 years old. If you haven't been out there, go out there and see Brian Mattingly and take a ride up there and go have a look at this tree. This is now the tree that will be nested in the herbarium, the National Herbarium, as the archetypal species for white oak, because it will be the first sequenced genome. It's kind of neat, but this is what it means to be a white oak. It's a pretty incredible tree. And the team used a series of approaches to arrive at a really high quality genome. And this was a non-trivial exercise that was that entire team that I presented before have lent into that to make this happen. And we have about 98% of the genome covered now, which is really high quality representation. We've compared it to things like red oak, and we understand the organismal overlap, what's different, what's similar. We know there's a lot of things about red oak that are not suitable, but we need to understand the ecology of what made white oak, and what, from an ecological sense, but also from an adaptive sense, that made it useful for staves and high quality staves for making American whiskies and then Scotch whiskies. So when we look at the quality, we have a really high percentage, and when we've looked at this in general, compared to other species that we have sequenced for, we have a really, really high quality genome, which is great to look at things like structural variation in oak. This is compared to chestnut, where you see chestnut on the bottom here. If I was getting into a genomics talk, I'd talk a little bit more about this. But when we talk about structural variations, we can then use this information to understand what made white oak adaptable for so many, such a long-lived species as the anchor to the eastern United States deciduous forests. And you think about that species that lives 300,000-500,000 years in a single location, producing acorns, nesting that forest. But there's also a lot of questions we want to ask about character and about what makes white oak really great for making staves. And so we have these structural variation maps that are really, really impressive. And one of the things that we have now is asking more and more questions about different oak species and how they compare across the eastern United States. And we're pushing on further and further into what is a massive replanting site that has been, again, stimulated by this thought. So now we have a genome that is from one tree in Kentucky. Kentucky's at the center of the universe, if you like. If you're white oak, it's right in the middle of the range. But what about all those fringe areas around the edges where you have hybridization with other oaks? And what about regions that have perhaps representation of diversity that might have those disease resistance genes? So there's been nearly 400 collections from all over the eastern United States planted on the one site at Stile Hill Farm. It'll be the largest planting of white oak anywhere in the United States, and it'll represent the entire range. So if there is ever a threat, then you can go into that population and interrogate it and ask for any resistance genes that then can be traced using genetic resources back to resistance to repopulate the white oak and have a sustainable supply. So it's a story a little bit about that really long-term vision that universities are well suited to taking, that we can think about, hey, we're looking at this as 100 years out. There is no issue right now, but if there was an issue, let's be prepared and let's think about it. And I think this is a unique situation that's really, inspired by that ecological thinking of Rob Samuels and Brian Mattingly and Brad Boswell and the team at Independent Stave that are thinking 100 years ahead and want to keep this supply there for the future. So I wanted to tell a little bit of that story today before the next talk, just to give you just a little feel good moving into the afternoon. But it's also really inspiring to see this tree and take the folks from Scotland to see a little bit of that progress that we've been making on white oak sustainability at a very deep level. All right, so I can take any questions if there are any, and if not, I can move along. And welcome Dr. James Brosnan, Director of the Whisky Research Institute, to the podium.
Anyway, good morning everyone, and good afternoon to my colleagues in Scotland, who some of whom may be watching if they haven't grown tired of my voice being away for a week. I want to begin first of all by just thanking you all. Thank you, Kentucky, for your hospitality. John and I have been having a tremendous time with your kindness and consideration for us. So thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'm going to be talking to you about sustainability and supply chain partnership, two things that I think should be irrevocably linked together. And I've called it straight from the horse's mouth, because I'm here today to give you a view from Scotland. I know from the few days I've spent coming round that met all of these themes that I will talk about and share with you today are things that you are also thinking about. So I'm not here to tell you things, I'm here to share things of how I see some of these sustainability issues from my Scottish perspective. But I've been in Kentucky long enough to know how you love sports. I've been here enough and thinking to start with some inspiration from your greatest ever Kentucky-born sporting hero, the greatest, and that of course is Kelso. Kelso, 5-time American Horse of the Year, a great hero of mine. But one thing Kelso couldn't do was to leave behind any quotes. So I had to go to another greatest who might have something to do with around here, and that's Muhammad Ali. And the question from this quote that he was asking about ambition, are distillers' sustainability dreams big and scary enough? When you talk about sustainability, there's quite a bit of this, we're doing that, but we're not quite sure how we're going to get there yet. Does that scare us? Maybe it should. But if we are feeling scared about sustainability, the way to combat that is through collaboration. Many of us have the same problems, whichever side of the Atlantic, whichever particular business you're in, and there's plenty of other people we can collaborate with, experts, whether or not they be from mines, mining engineers, etc., who can actually try and make us feel a bit less scared. Now, collaboration is what the business I work for is all about, the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, based just outside Edinburgh. We are the Scotch whisky industry's research and technology organisation. So we're owned by the Scotch whisky industry, we're funded by our member companies, and I like to think of what we do and the way we do it as being a research club. And we have over 50 years, or approaching 50 years of pre-competitive research on our books. And as Seth has already said, it means that we have the opportunity to take the long view. Now, if you look at our sort of members just over there in the right-hand side, you'll see many familiar names. Companies with their footprints in Scotland, their footprints over here in Kentucky, all part of that same club through parent companies or by owning Scotch whisky interests. And at SWRI, we're doing research to try and support our industry in Scotland's sustainability objectives. So we've got ongoing research to try and enhance sustainability of production processes, but also to understand the impact of climate adaptation and how that might affect the flavour profile of Scotch whisky going forward. I thought it's probably useful just to mention about sustainability. The fact is, quite rightly, we have this big focus on environmental sustainability, but it's very multidimensional. We heard about the minimum no-till systems. The farmer still has to make a profit if there's still going to be farmers. So people, profit, planet all have to come together, and this is an important thing that needs to be kept in mind. After all, why should whisky making be sustainable? Because the operations of the entire whisky production world across the world will not save the planet of its own self. So why do we be sustainable? Well, of course, to meet our consumer expectations, increasingly important. Also, with our investors, expect to see sustainability credentials. And of course, regulators and government will be pushing us in directions. But increasingly, I've heard about consumers going around Kentucky in the last 3 days. I haven't heard a lot about government compulsion or regulation. And people are enthused in the distilling industry, in Scotland and here, because being sustainable is doing the right thing. It might help your profit as well, but it's essentially doing the right thing. So people aren't talking about, oh, I'll try not to do any harm. People are trying to think about how their operations are going to do some good. And ultimately, it's by being able to demonstrate that in a credible way is going to give us and justify our ability to make whisky in the future. We're an industry that provides sunlight and colour into an awful lot of the environments in which we operate, and we need to be able to continue to do that. Within Scotland, the industry has come together with a joint sustainability strategy that's under the banner of our trade association, the Scotch Whisky Association, if you like, your KDA equivalent here. And this has got 4 main pillars on environmental sustainability. One around climate change, one around responsible water use, one around circular economy, and one about caring for the land. And you can see within some of the breakdown of words within that, things that are already being used this morning about that, things like regenerative agriculture, looking at net zero barley, things like this. But also in terms of what we're doing with the co-products or byproducts of our industry as well. So we have to be able to take on all of these things. So what is this sustainability strategy that the industry in Scotland has signed up to? How are we going to deliver on this? Well, the truthful answer is we've got lots of enthusiasm. We know where we're going in many senses, but to achieve the targets that we need to achieve and the timescale we need to achieve it will require change. It's going to require new knowledge, and therefore it really needs research, and it needs to have the technical professionals to be engaged with to do that. And increasingly, we see those professionals in sustainability being employed directly within the industry. But no matter how many of those people you employ, you still need to do far more. So just taking greenhouse gas changes, for example, we as distilling companies cannot do everything. We're dealing with our Scope 1, our Scope 2, and our Scope 3 emissions, particularly the Scope 3. We're in and around the supply chain. How do we actually respond to this? And I've used this kind of slide, admittedly I've changed the pictures for the current audience. I've used this slide actually back in the in talks in Europe because I think it's a powerful image in the way that American football works. So we have players. Now, if we're looking at distillery efficiency, the distillers are the players. We are controlling what we do, and we can define and take action on that. Within the supply chain, things are a bit more complex. We can't just leave it to the farmers to do. We can't just tell them, oh, we want to do this. We need to facilitate. We need to cheerlead. We need to enthusiastically support their, what they're doing. I've heard quite a bit in the last few days about people getting agronomists into farming communities, being able to work with the farmers, showing giving the farmers the help they need, but not trying to tell them what to do, to make sure there's a research collaborations so we can be there cheerleading that on. In circular economy, that's an interesting one, players and cheerleaders both, because we actually are actually become producers of whether or not that's bioenergy from anaerobic digestion or our animal feeds that we're producing. We're part of somebody else's supply chain as well. But cheerleading or playing, we need effective teamwork. Now, for greenhouse gas reduction, you cannot control what you cannot measure. And this is another theme. We've got to make sure there are some level playing fields over what you're measuring. If people in Kentucky and Scotland are talking about hitting targets, how are those targets being set, and how are we measuring our progress to getting there? And we have to balance our reduction in emissions across scopes 1 to 3. So that you can be doing that by doing things more efficiently, by sequestering CO2, maybe even some offsetting if it's appropriate. But you can't just focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions if you're not keeping a big picture, a holistic approach to things like biodiversity and the impact, and some of the work that's being done there that we've seen great biodiversity work in and around the oak trees and things like that. And also, distillers have to think about how you measure things. So you might be measuring the success of your grain for the amount of alcohol per unit of grain, the number of gallons that you're getting from that ton of grain. But do we now need to start thinking a bit broader than that? The amount of alcohol you're getting from that field, from that acre in that, and redefining what you do with this. Now, I'd like to shift now to talk a little bit about the transition to circular economy in terms of what we're trying to create in Scotland. We have our co-products. We need to be able to do things with them. Can we even increase the value of our co-products with what we're doing? And how can a lot of emerging technologies be stitched together for maximum benefit? Now, a small-sized malt distillery will be producing about, 500,000 gallons of alcohol, but it also generates a whole load of other stuff as well in terms of the draff, the pot ale, the liquid from distillation, the spent lees, and also biogenic CO2. We need to consider, whatever size of distillery you are, where does this go? Well, for animal feed maybe at the moment, anaerobic digestion is really popular in Scotland. The possibilities of spread to land as fertilizer, biomass boilers, but the CO2 is mainly still vented to the atmosphere. So there are lots of opportunities and barriers that we have. In the 130 plus malt whiskey distilleries in Scotland, they vary hugely in size. Many are in very rural locations. Maker's Mark seemed like a bit of a drive down some roads, but it's got nothing on, I have to say, on a lot of Scottish distilleries, which it's an act of faith to keep driving along some of those roads, but to get there. There's competition for space. A lot of utilization for co-products might conflict with, say, tourist centres or other things there. And particularly, there isn't going to be one solution to suit all. So research is required to explore new technologies and how these can be used together. And also to look whether or not our biomass can be twinned with other industries and their biomass so that we can actually work together, perhaps to get some more whole-scale solutions. Now, time doesn't allow me to go through this in detail, but we have another Science Innovation Centre within Scotland, the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre, and which SWRI are a member of. And within that, we've been working with some of their members, and I've just picked out 4 here, who are doing really interesting things with co-products. Horizon Proteins would be getting a high density protein feed for fish, Scottish salmon, good circular economy there going, and also to try and remove material to allow a better material going into anaerobic digestion. My algae will be growing up algae, as the name suggests, to get higher value omega 3 oils out of it, which is adding value, again potentially as fish food. Xanthella are again using algae, but they're using sunlight and CO2 to try and grow the algae. So there you're actually capturing some of the CO2 that's being used. And then Celtic Renewables are looking at acetone, biobutanol, bioethanol production. Again, familiar processes, but being applied specifically to our co-products. And looking now at going from pilot to demonstrator scales, which is very exciting. With responsible water use, yes, we want to conserve water, we want to use water efficiently, and it means process change, whether or not in our malting, cooking, mashing processes. We're looking at breeding cereal varieties with lower viscosity loads to enable perhaps more water addition. And also looking at identification of yeast strains that perform well at high gravities with that. So there's things there that we can actively do in research, but the big question that always comes back, how will this affect my flavour? Remember, we use less yeast strains than you do in Scotland by and large, and we don't have as varied mash bills. So some of this could represent really significant change to us. What about flavour? Well, I would argue that the sustainability of flavour is the big thing that we must not lose sight about. We have to make sure that with all these clever technologies being implemented to meet sustainability credentials, we do not lose flavour diversity in the Scotch whisky industry. So if we start adopting technologies, does flavour become more interesting? So therefore, flavour research is required to understand the origins of these flavours and how they can be controlled. And the benchmarking is a key thing. Here we have, this is a flavour map of New Make Spirit produced in Scotland. Most of these distilleries will be using very similar yeast strains and very similar mash bills going through, but there's a huge amount of flavour diversity generated through the distillery into New Make Spirit that you can see here. And we do these surveys, we've been doing them for over 20 years now, to map out the long-term, if there's any long-term drift in terms of flavour coming through New Make Spirit. So we've got that benchmarking in place so we can be careful about the changes we make. On an optimistic note on that, there is certainly no shortage of flavour complexity within single Scotch whisky. This is a GC olfactometry or aromagram with, I think, over 90 individual flavours coming through, all being put together to make something Scotch whisky-like in there. Now, when we're talking about Scotch whisky flavour, many people will, of course, be thinking about peat. We get the peat, the smoky medicinal aromas in Scotch through the using peat smoke with malted barley, and it's not used in all Scotch whisky. In fact, majority of Scotch whisky doesn't use peated malt, but it is a signature flavour for us. And the peat that comes from different areas around Scotland differs in terms of its chemical composition and subsequent spirit flavours. We know a lot more about the chemistry of this now as well. But peatlands, of course, are a key environmental resource in terms of carbon capture. So we need to be showing that we are protecting peatlands with this. Now, distillers use a minuscule amount of peat, relative terms for our process, but it's absolutely required that we use this with the maximum efficiency. We're doing a lot of research on that. Again, in collaboration, because most of our peated malt will be coming from our maltsters, members of the Maltsters Association of Great Britain. So we're collaborating with them to make sure that we are improving the efficient use of peat for this key part of Scotch whisky flavour. So in terms of the collaborations, I've talked about supply chain collaboration. A key thing for us is barley. Barley, I would argue, as a cereal scientist, and my friend John can contradict me with maturation, is the true foundation of whiskey, or whiskey. It's the #1 crop in Scotland, #2 in the United Kingdom, but #4 globally. So it misses out on the medal positions there. And it's probably, though, the most versatile cereal in a global sense. You can find it all over the world. And it is a core global food source as well as being really good for making beer and whiskey. But there are a lot of key challenges that it has. Climate change is now limiting both local and global availability, and there's also increasing variability in quality. And I can illustrate this just with a very United Kingdom-centric picture. We've done modelling work with the James Hutton Institute to looking at climate change likely effects. In 1976, we had the hottest summer any of us can kind of like remember. If you were born then, I was 10, that's the summer, it never rained. That's on the left-hand side. That's a projection for the similar amount of time going forward. And this colouring is for plant heat stress. And the significant impact that we will see here, Scotland still looks pretty green, which is good, but that green's got a lot lighter. There's going to be a significant challenge to growing barley for our local source supply. And probably we're looking better here than other parts of Europe, certainly, facing over this same time period. So what questions do we need to do to address this? Well, the lack of genetic diversity in elite populations means that they're more vulnerable to changing climate and disease threats. Global barley research, it tends to be more fragmented or underfunded, certainly in the public sphere of public funding, and to a significant sense within major seed companies as well. So how to ensure that long-term resilient supply of high-quality barley for malting food other users? And we felt that we needed a coordinated approach to barley research because there's a real time of opportunity. Seth mentioned the word genome. He said it put people to sleep. We have the same thing here with the genome of barley. We've now got great opportunities for really solving these problems with what we know. So within the United Kingdom, the supply chain and academic science came together to try and talk about forming an international barley hub that hopefully would have this global outlook for us. And whereas this is intended to be a virtual organization, good science also does need a proper return on investment. And we persuaded both the United Kingdom government and the Scottish government to put in significant money for new infrastructure at the James Hutton Institute to be focused on barley. And because I don't know what it's like here, I'm sure everything's smooth, but between more local and national government, we sometimes have a bit of friction, but barley brings people together here. So I'm not going to talk about buildings too much, but there's going to be a main barley science building that will be coming on stream in hopefully 18 months' time, but the Barley Field Research Centre will be opening in the next few weeks, which is really exciting. And in all our supply chain dialogue that we had, we were looking, there were really two things that came up, what the supply chain wanted: climate-resistant barley and low-input barley, so decarbonising that barley production. And we have so many different tools and exciting things we can look at. The whole of genetic diversity that there is in barley will be fantastic. We need to look at all that soil management for better, more reliable, stable production of barley, looking after the soils. But we also, for climate resilience, we need to think global. Barley appears on the fringes of the Sahara Desert. It appears halfway up the Andes Mountains. There really is great opportunity by looking at the global genetic and knowledge resources about growing barley to actually solve local problems like growing barley in Kentucky or making sure we still have barley surviving in Scotland. So thinking global. But the other point there is we need to look at the both short, long, and medium goals. But one project is not going to do all of this. There is not a silver bullet. It is taking that fully integrated approach, looking at all the different strands of science that we actually need to do. Sensor technology, robotics, I was talking about this morning before the things started. There is absolutely the type of thing that's being done at the university here of trying to get all the scientists involved, not just the ones who traditionally work in particular areas, but getting the whole world of science to answer our problems. And also looking at economic and social science as well to see where the impacts will go. But above all, this perhaps comes down to people. The people that you actually need, not just the people here today, but the people of the future. And again, through UK government funding and industry barley supply chain collaboration, we've started on a new program that's kicking off this month called the Barley Industry Training Network, or Baritone, which has got 18 different industry partners across the whole supply chain. And we're going to be supporting 30 PhD students to work on barley sustainability. This will address issues relevant to the barley supply chain in terms of climate resilience, lowering inputs, and also soil health. But mainly, I see the output is creating a future generation of barley experts in industry and academia, and to support that overall ethos of the International Barley Hub for collaboration in barley science across the supply chain. So this is going to be a really exciting development for us. And these are just 4 of the projects that are being kicked off with their supply chain sponsor. Again, looking at soil in the rhizome sheath, looking at barley metabolites and their links to genetics, sensor technology to improve barley nutrient management, and then developing novel phytonutrients from the co-products of Whisky as well. They're all sponsored by different companies. We've got an international distiller getting involved in areas where you otherwise a few years ago wouldn't have seen them active in this space. This is the cheerleading in action, building for the future and the people who will solve our future problems. So my last slide is just to acknowledge the idea of partnership, and where there's an obvious area for partnership with Kentucky, that's in our cask supply chain. We have a long life cycle of casks in Scotland after they've done their time in Kentucky, and that requires long-term partners and our shared objectives. So it's great to be here and having that opportunity. I title this horse straight from the horse's mouth. There's no point in me talking about wood when my colleague John Connor is here to take up that. But just thinking back to horses again, perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps Kelso, the Wonder Horse, can actually give us some message about sustainability. And I think if you check out the YouTube videos on this from the early 60s, you will see for sustainability, we need to accelerate at pace. But we also need that stamina for the long distance run. And above all, we need to have the courage and determination to stay with it to make sure we win that sustainability race. And for you all here in Kentucky, just ending on an invitation, the Institute of Brewing and Distilling in Scotland is hosting a worldwide distilled spirits conference in the second week of May. You are all cordially invited to, and I look forward to the opportunity to welcoming you to Scotland. And I just hope we can make you feel half as welcome as John and I has felt. So thank you very much.
Questions, please. So I have one sort of a structural question about the engagement between the Hutton Institute, where the Barley Research Centre is going to be housed. Is there how did you go about initiating those conversations and bridging those gaps with public and private funding?
By doing lots of talking. We started our relationship with the James Hutton Institute back in 1995, where we had a common problem that we had an issue that we wanted them to sort out, and they had the genetic understanding of how that could be done, and that's in the selection of non-GN varieties of barley, which was really successful. So it's been a long-term partnership, and we could see that the need for the funding. So we had lots of roadshows. We talked to lots of people in the the public decision makers, but we also had to get the support of the supply chain to make that credible. It wasn't just a bunch of scientists wanting more buildings and to put more instruments in to do more science. It was an ask by the industry, and the barley industry in the United Kingdom is is a significant financial supporter in terms of our exports and that. So there was a good argument saying this is a key crop, government needs to support it.
Thank you. I think we've got it recorded, and
Specifically about the anaerobic digestion and the generation of biogases or to fuel boilers or combined heat and power units, that kind of thing. Do you guys have any information on the volumes of biogases generated from specific quantities of, I'm not sure, I call it distiller spent grains or stillage, what's coming off the bottom of the still after the alcohol is all gone, that waste stream. Do you have gas volume, production of gas volume per some unit of that waste stream?
With the price of gas, it's working well for some distilleries that have adopted that in Scotland at the moment, making your own energy. Yeah.
I'll try this again.
Thank you. I'm very curious about the concept of low input barley, yet getting good quality barley that has the enzymes that you want. Maybe that's a longer discussion later, but there's some concepts about that we see here as well from time to time. And you're talking about opposing goals typically in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, that is probably an offline thing. We don't claim to have solved all those problems now. I just want to emphasize that. It helps with malt distilling when you've got 100% malted barley mash. Keeping the rye out of it can actually sometimes work for you.
If there's no more questions, I'll ask one about the timing. So we definitely want to arrive right around then, because the coronation of a new king is taking place right before this.
70 years. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, the 6th of May will be the coronation. So that was not obviously a planned event, but it could be a really exciting time. But what that means logistically is a bit uncertain. But that'll be down in London. So this is Edinburgh.
Make your way around that, Kai.
So you talk about the race to sustainability and not being scared of setting these goals, setting big, scary goals. How do you work with this when you have a variety of sizes of distilleries? You have small guys who may not have the resources to do the kind of things that the big guys do. And we face that here. So how do you guys face that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, with the, and it is the same there, the Scotch Whisky Association membership is very sort of wide, includes, some really small startup distillers as well. And I think it's about leadership and about enthusiasm. And I think that works in both large and small companies. Of course, the large ones have got lots of technical know-how, lots of things there. But small companies sometimes can be very agile and do things as well. And mainly it's the mindset of wanting to achieve. It's clearly obvious that the industry leaders will tend to lead. You'd expect more of the step change technology to emanate there. But we've got good examples of small distillers in Scotland also kind of thinking a bit outside the box, or being able, because of their small size, to be really, really local and develop local answers for them, which of course is, if you're using half the cereal area of Scotland for your couple of your products, then talking about the upside or the downside of a field doesn't mean a great deal. So there are different solutions maybe to the same problem.
question? Roger, you good? Okay. All right, well, please join me in thanking Dr. Brosnan for an excellent talk. And on that note, our final speaker is Dr. John Connor from On the Maturation, Scotland Style. Take it away.
I would just like to add my thanks to those of James for everyone's hospitality while I've been here in Kentucky. It's certainly been a fascinating visit. And a bit like James, I'm quite fond of starting talks with quotes. One I never thought I would use was by Coco Chanel. But that's really about how fashions change but style endures. So this talk is really my presentation of how we produce, how we do things differently in Scotland that creates its sort of, if you want, its enduring appeal. And it's not all down to maturation, though, of course, given my background. I think it is a big part. I picked out sort of 4 areas that I think contribute to Scotland. First of those is the diversity of new make distillates we create. And you saw from James's slides that although it's the same basic process that's used by most distilleries, then you do get quite an enormous variation in the number of distillates we produce. I would add to that the reuse of casks, our climate, and of course, because we've got such a diverse palette to work with, blending also makes its own contribution. So I'd just like to take some time to work through each of these in turn. I'll not spend too much time on the diversity of new freshly distilled spirits. That comes from our raw materials, the water, malted barley, and of course our use of yeast. I was going to focus on the use of peat, but James has already done that. It's not just the raw materials, it's the way we're processing them, so the mashing, the fermentation, the distillation, so wort filtration, whether it's a clear or a cloudy wort, gravity, what gravity you start your fermentation at, that has an influence on your ester content. And then, of course, still shape is something that, you know, the malt distillers in particular are very keen on preserving, and that's to preserve the sort of level of reflux, so the amount of separation you get within each distillation and how much carries over. And that governs also where you set your cut points and condenser types. And I think it was one of the quotes I heard this week from Don McGrew was that it's actually amazing we actually produce a consistent product rather than where the variations come from. Hopefully I have to admit this is not my area of expertise, and hopefully I haven't embarrassed my colleagues back home by my descriptions of this. Getting more onto that, it's about the reuse of casks. So in Scotland, the reason we reuse casks is we don't really have a huge supply of oak that's suitable for cooperage. So that means that in the past, Scotch whisky has been matured in second-hand containers. You know, these could be old brandy barrels and rum barrels, sherry casks, ex-bourbon barrels, old wine barrels. So there is a diversity of the sort of casks that were used. The ones that became the predominant ones were, of course, ex-sherry casks and bourbon casks. And not only do we reuse casks, but we carry on using them. So to go into a bit of the background about this, I would like to think the 2 main ones, bourbon and sherry casks, and they actually create very different mature products. Not all of it is actually down to what was in the cask beforehand. But what you do find, oh sorry, I missed my slides, even though I can see them there. So just a bit about why we don't have suitable cooperage oak in Scotland. So the white oak we have in Scotland is actually at the limit of its range when it gets, there are 2 species, Quercus robur, which is pedunculate oak, and Quercus petrea, the sessile oak. They're at the actual limit of the range. And as you see, the sessile oak misses out the top of the north of Scotland. And these two oak are the white oaks of Scotland, and there are only 2 species, and it's a bit different from the States where there's a much bigger variety of oak species. But these tend to be the dominant ones. And the oaks in Scotland came from Spain after the last ice age, so they have much in common with the sort of French and the Spanish oaks that are used in wine casks, and they progress northwards. And what they seem to suggest is that Quercus robur is a pioneering species, so it's the one that pushes further north, whereas Quercus petrea is the one that almost proceeds by pollen, and so it hybridizes with robur, and then stands generally become more and more sessile as the oaks progress north. And that creates, in a way, it sort of suggests that it's agronomic conditions, that the way where the oaks are growing in Scotland are the differences. These tend to be genetically similar to what you would get in France and Spain, where you've got Quercus robur, which produces a lot of tannins, and but Quercus petrea is much more like the American oak. So the next thing I wanted to concentrate on was on the reuse of casks, and how when you're looking at wine and spirit casks, it's not just what was in the cask beforehand, it's what the actual material that was in actually takes out the wood, because there's a finite amount of extractives within the oak. Much of those are created when the cask is made, and then during its life that takes on. So if you look at a comparison of take the same piece of wood and extract it with 18% ethanol, which is what you would say sherry strength was, and then with a higher strength alcohol such as a spirit, then you find in that first extract, so it's a use for bourbon or a use for sherry, that the spirit would take out a lot more from that wood. So what that means is when it comes to Scotland, that cask, you get a lot more colour and extractives from a sherry cask than you do from a bourbon cask. And that creates that, and then gradually as we reuse them, you get less out of it with each fill. And that is one of the reasons, so you get very different, again, you're increasing the diversity of what you're producing when you're using different cask types. And that's not adding into that mix what comes from the cask the first time. The reuse of casks, again, is also quite important. If casks are used multiple times, then what you find is that the flavour profile drops. Now, that doesn't necessarily, it might not be a good thing for bourbon, but when you're a Scotch, then that reduces the impact of the wood. So actually the distillate actually becomes more important. So it's what you see from James is saying, is that cereal is really important. And one of the things that the maturation does is it allows you to appreciate those much more differences between your distillates, but they still have to be well matured. And that's one of the problems, that as you reuse the casks again and again, its ability to mature the spirit drops. So when you're producing a product, what you have to do is balance the reused casks with the first fill casks. And that gives producers the ability to control just what that impact is between wood and what's coming from your distillate. The next thing that influences ours is climate. And Scotland is a sort of maritime climate, so it's very humid. I did look this up on Google, and the furthest you get from the sea in Scotland is 40 miles. Whereas I think here we're about 500 miles plus from the nearest sea. So again, it means they're very humid. Actually, I put this up as a bit of humour, but actually I was looking at it and thinking, maybe the other reason we don't have cooperage, we don't get cooperage oak is we have difficulty drying it. I know certainly even in northern Spain, they have to move it to the south for the final seasoning period. But yeah, the two important elements of the climate are the temperature and the humidity. So temperatures lower temperature, not surprising, slower changes with lower losses. And again, that means if you combine that with the reuse of casks, what it means is that we tended to define our quality by age rather than the cask type where it was produced. So that's why, you know, we say Scotland places emphasis on things like the aging, so the 10-year-old, the 8-year-old, because that is a measure of the sort of quality and the length of time it's been maturing. It does mean when I say things go slower, then it does have a difference. So this is a profile, a maturation profile from a cask in one of our warehouses, and we've been sampling this monthly. And what that does allow us is it allows us to see the sort of seasonal influences that there are on our maturation. So you see that initially there's a big increase in the level of colour in extractives, and that's because it's mostly determined by the concentration in the wood diffusing into the spirit. But as you see, you get towards winter, there's a plateau, and in the summer. In this experiment, about 80% of the annual increase in colour comes during the summer months. If I can overlay the temperature profile from our cask, then what you would see is that most of the extraction happens whenever the temperature gets above 12 degrees centigrade, which is about 54 Fahrenheit. And just for the limits of that, I think 4 is about 39, is it? And then 20 is up about 68, if I've remembered those rightly. So you see that for that in Scotland, our cooler summers, we get a much slower change in our whiskey. And again, that's with losing less than it means, sorry, I mean, losing less is actually the subject to the next slide. And that's about warehouse temperature. And essentially, losses show an exponential relationship with our temperature. And this is what we've used our internal store, changing temperature and keeping humidity constant to show that. It varies from, there's a considerable cask-to-cask variation. The exponential relationship is actually best fit for casks that lose less. If it gets to be leaking, if there's an obvious leak in the cask, then it's more, if you want, a noisy linear relationship. And part of that noise is the leaks are driven by pressure. So when you're changing the temperature in the room, it depends on whether you're going up or whether you're going down. Because if you're going up, you generate pressure in the cask. If you're going down, you decrease the pressure in the cask because of how the spirit expands and contracts. The one thing we did find in this set of experiments was that daily cycling didn't really increase losses and no impact on losses. And part of that is about the thermal inertia that Stephen was talking about, is that the temperature's going up and down during the day. It's not actually transferring directly to the spirit, and it's over the longer term seasonal changes that you're seeing there. But the important thing about that for Scott is that we can leave our spirit in the cask for 10 years and still have a reasonable amount left at the end of it. Which in warmer climates is maybe not something that you can do. Yeah, the other factor is humidity. And the main point with that is because Scotland is more humid, then actually you lose less water. Doesn't affect the loss of ethanol, but you lose less water. And so to illustrate this, again, this is a sort of maturation trial we've done in 2-member warehouses, one of which I would have described as dry, so the relative humidity is about 80%, and the other is humid, so it's just over 90%. The ethanol loss in these warehouses, the barrels in these warehouses over a year, was the same, so it's about 2.2% per annum. But the dry warehouse lost just over a kilogram of water, whereas in the humid warehouse they actually gained a kilo of water, and that had a big impact on how the strength changed. So in the dry warehouse, strength barely changed, but in the humid warehouse, the strength dropped by 1%. I just took a few slides to show some of the other data we collected from these warehouses. So that's the relative humidity. We were recording temperature as well. So from those two variables, you cannot work out what the absolute humidity is. If you look at that absolute humidity, so that's the average daily humidity over the recording period, you see increases in the summer, it's quite low in winter. And we were quite fortunate, and this was close to a weather station. It was one of the things we didn't do quite as well with this project. We should have spent more time with weather stations so we knew what the outside humidity was. And if you overlay that humidity, you see the outside humidity is actually a lot spikier, but it does tend to follow the same general trend. And it's not surprising because, you know, the warehouses are ventilated, so you can't actually stop air coming in from the outside. But what we did work with this one is that particularly during winter and spring and summer, that if you sort of work the equations back, so you use the outside humidity to work out what the inside humidity should be rather than what we were reading, that there was about 54 days that year in the year where the humidity in the warehouse would have gone above 100%, which again would lead to condensation type within the warehouses, and most of those were actually in the winter and in the spring and summer. But when you look at it, just looking from those, that seems to have been stored up by the warehouse. And where you notice it being the humidity in the warehouse, the absolute humidity in the warehouse being higher than the outside humidity, that tends to be in the summer and in the autumn and winter. So it's not surprising that the warehouse can store that humidity. You've got lots of absorbent surfaces within that, but it seems to be that as the warehouse heats up, that's when it's released. Don't know if it's any help to you, Steve, but just thought of that when preparing this talk. And of course, one of the things about it is humidity influences the maturation process. And the way I would look at this is quite a few of the places we were at, people were showing us the difference between spirits at the top of the warehouse, where it's warm and dry, and the bottom of the warehouse, where it's cooler and damper. And that's the situation that humidity has for the maturation in Scotland. Although it tends to be cooler, that decrease in strength does have, in my view, a positive impact on maturation. So we know extraction of colour and components is reduced at high and low alcoholic strengths. So yeah, as the strength goes down, you may extract more colour from the wood. There's slower removal of sulphur compounds, so these are compounds that cause immature character during the maturation. And of course, oxidation reactions are slower at higher alcoholic strengths. So that's me sort of finished the bits that are my area of expertise. The final one I chose was blending, because one of the things is Scotch's popularity around the world was produced by blended products. So that's where you're taking, you do blending within a distillery across cask types, etc. But this is where you're combining malt whiskies and grain whiskies to create a consistent and appealing product. It's not a step-by-step process. It's done through understanding component whiskies, addition levels, and how they vary between batches. The blenders rely on their expertise to select the appropriate whiskies and which ones will make the cut for the band. And a lot of them actually know as individual casks to prevent any off notes or casks with defects in them. As you see, I've got a bit more stuttering over that because, that's my limit of knowledge of blending. It's not an area that I would profess to know much about. So I just thought I would finish again this time with a quote, Robert Burns from To a Mouse. And it's about the future, and it's about what James was saying. And this is about the type of research that we at the Institute would do. So looking at this sort of maturation research group, then what we would be looking, the things that we are going to have to change to have to improve our sustainability are things that will influence flavour. So the new make spirit character. So that understanding how that changes during maturation is actually one of the key components of our research. Because that, if people are making changes, they see the changes straight away. So how will they influence the product in 5, 10 years time? That's an important one. And of course, increasing maturation losses. If climate predictions are right, then Scotland's temperature will go up by, well, round about 2 degrees. That will increase our loss. What can we do to stop that? And can we actually, since losses are actually lost production, then how can we actually reduce that? And to what level can we reduce that won't have an impact on quality? So, thank you all for your your attention. And if you have any questions, then I will do my best to answer them. I was then going to actually say, probably from having spoken to people, the other quote I should give you is, "And I'll be back."
Oxidation reactions are lower at higher alcohol contents. A bit interested in that in respect to, have you measured oxidation or dissolved oxygen in situ during maturation?
We haven't measured dissolved oxygen in situ. This is actually using our, if you want, a model reaction that we think is important in the process, and seeing how that changes during with alcoholic strength. So, initially we started off looking at things that could produce things like activated forms of oxygen, and then seeing how that changed with strength. But from that work, I think we've got a much better model of how the oxidation actually works in a cask, and that also shows a decrease at higher alcoholic strengths. Not really sure how to explain it, because one of the things you think is, if you generate an active form of oxygen, then one of the things that would determine the rate is how likely, what's that likely to interact with? And of course, in spirit, it's ethanol. But if you're increasing the strength, so there has to be something else that's having an influence there.
So, well, I thought it was real interesting on your time slides there that you're seeing a lot of the same time delays that we're seeing in our weather data as well. So I'm happy to see that. Then also the other point that you were talking about, when you start getting up in the high humidity levels and things like that, and that was something I was told I failed to mention in my presentation over the break, is that we didn't really talk about what are generally here called like microclimates that develop within these within the maturation warehouses. And I guess the questions, you said these houses are ventilated, and can you expand on that, like how exactly you guys are ventilating these things?
Most warehouses, it's top and bottom ventilation. So yeah, they're naturally ventilated. So it would be bottom vents and then a ridge vent in most warehouses. So it's not forced ventilation, sorry, if I gave that impression. But actually, I mean, having thought that, the ethanols that we would see, the ethanol levels we would see in our warehouses can be a good deal lower, and particularly in winter, when the temperature's lower, the evaporation rate drops really quite low. So during the winter, we don't tend to see the same sort of levels as you would be seeing in January and February time.
I think quite often we're seeing that the levels are more a matter of loading and unloading. So as houses are being loaded, then the levels are creeping up, and as they get unloaded,
you'll see a drop and then a spike again as they get material in. The time of the year has not as big an impact on it in the data that we've collected so far, but you know, that's only a few years of data now and more to come. Right? So, thank you.
Roger, you'll be sticking with us for the next little bit, so we can follow on after that. If there are no further questions, please join me in thanking all the speakers for a really great symposium. And I'm going to, for everyone out there in virtual land, really thank you so much for joining us today. I think we apologize for the technical glitches on audio, and the recording will have audio if you want to go back and catch up on anything that you missed. This will be recorded and sent out to everybody on the back end of this. But what this highlights to me is a broader need for more dialogue, more collaboration, and this just seeds hopefully some really productive opportunities in the future for us to learn from each other and extend this collaboration on into the future. Definitely for a visit to Edinburgh next year in May. And so once again, thank you for attending, and we'll see you all soon.